فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. I first want to start off by doing a reflection of season 1. So season 1, we did a lot of really important, interesting things. I talked about the story of Maryam in the Qur'an, also did some reflections of programs and places I spoke, and I also started doing some interviews. So of people in the field, people I've interacted with, scholars I've read their works of. So in this podcast, I want to reflect on season 1 and talk about what I'm thinking about for season 2. To begin, when I started this podcast, I had fear and vulnerability. And one of the things that Maryam has helped me explore is the idea of vulnerability, chronic vulnerability. She's very open about her feelings. She asked the angel, how is this going to happen? How am I going to have a child? How am I going to give birth? Later, as we'll see in surat Maryam, or the chapter on Mary, that she says that she wished she had died and disappeared and been someone who was forgotten. So Maryam has opened certain doors for me personally, as well as professionally in terms of my research of exploring this idea of vulnerability. And when I started this podcast, I didn't know if anyone would actually listen. So I'm really grateful to all of you for taking time out of your busy week to listen to the show. And many of you have contacted me and given me some really important feedback. And just like when you start anything new, when I started teaching, would anyone sign up for my classes? When I started writing, I wondered, will anyone download this article and actually read it? And as I'm writing the Islamic Mary book, I'm also have those same doubts and fears. And will anyone actually pick up this book and make it part of their reading schedule and then incorporate some of the values and lessons into their life? Also, some funny stories when I started this podcast. Initially, I didn't know what I was doing, right? So it was all kind of new to me. One specific story is I remember recording a podcast and the microphone was actually the wrong way. And when I listened to the recording, I was like, I can't really hear myself and I sound like very distant and faint. And then I did some research and found out that I have to turn the microphone around and actually have it point towards me. And then there's actually a front and a back to my microphone. So that was something. Learning the tech is always challenging. Also, I bought this really expensive recording software initially, and I was like, oh, okay, the software is going to make everything wonderful and great, and then it's going to let me upload my podcast to Apple Podcasts and Spotify and other podcast platforms. But then I realized that a podcasting hosting site is actually different than recording software. So you actually have to upload your podcast to a podcast hosting site, and that is actually going to put it onto all the major networks. So just learning the tech, the different softwares you can use, it was difficult and challenging, but I think I've gotten my head around it. Also, as I mentioned, I've been exploring different formats. So one of the things I love doing is teaching, sharing what I've learned through my research. And a lot of this podcast has been me teaching, sharing every week 15 to 20 minutes of a particular verse or lesson and some exegetical scriptural commentary. So that's something I definitely want to continue in season 2. And we have gone through all the verses in Ali Imran regarding the story of Maryam. And now we're going to go into the chapter of Mary itself, surat Maryam. And I'm really excited to share some of the things I've read and some of the insights I've gained throughout the last couple of years. Also, I want to continue the interviews. So as I've been writing and researching, you always hit that article or that book and you're like, wow, this is amazing. This article has given me this new insight. This book has transformed the way I've looked at a particular subject. And I'm fortunate that there's a good network of people interested in biblical and Quranic studies, as well as interreligious studies. And they're always really fascinating and open to sharing their points of view on different topics. So I'm going to continue to explore that network, and especially when it comes to themes related to the Islamic Mary. So questions of women and spirituality, questions of religion and interfaith studies, questions of scripture in the modern world. So I want to continue to interview folks within the networks, especially people I've encountered. I heard their talks and speeches at different conferences or universities, as well as I've read their works in my research and writing. Also, I want to continue the recaps. So the recap of a particular section. One of the things I try to do with my students in my class is always recap. We finish a unit, finish a section, and say, okay, what did we learn here? What did all these verses or the section in the Qur'an or in the Bible, what is it telling us? What is the message? What is the lesson that we can learn and the authors are trying to convey? So recaps, I think, are really important. It kind of summarizes what we've learned. And it's always good to review and to think about how we can incorporate what we learned into our daily lives. And last, I want to continue the reflections. So I'm really fortunate to travel and go to different workshops and programs. And a lot of them have to do with the Quran and Bible. So I talked about already the Catholic Biblical Association where I spoke at. I went to the Building Bridges seminar this last summer, sponsored by Georgetown. And I have a couple of opportunities to travel, such as the American Academy of Religion conference I'll be going to in November, as well as be a speaker regarding interreligious studies in the spring. So as I go and travel and see these different places related to the podcast, I definitely want to share my reflections with all of you and also hear your feedback. It's always nice when you are writing alone by yourself or you're doing this podcast as a solitary event, and then you go and you interact with people, and then you see how they engage with your work and how they incorporate it into their teaching, into their spiritual journey. And other thing I've really come to appreciate is that there's an audience for this content. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there is always that fear. You don't know if anyone's going to listen, anyone's going to care. Is anybody going to read this? Is anyone going to listen to this podcast? But I've met several people within my networks that have been listening to the podcast, and even people I've just met digitally or online that found the content meaningful. So one group of audience that I've met are professors. So there are professors like me who are teaching, and they are also engaged in interreligious studies. They're teaching the Quran and the Bible. They want to make sure that their students have access to the latest knowledge and research regarding the topic. So some professors have been using this podcast within their classes. I've actually used it in a class I'm teaching right now on marriage and sexuality in Islam to help introduce myself to my students. And I found that students are accustomed to listening to podcasts. So podcasts is something that young people are more accustomed to compared to older generations. So people maybe in their 50s or 60s didn't grow up listening to podcasts. But a lot of people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, this is something that's normative. They grew up with a smartphone. They all know the podcasting apps, and they listen to podcasts on their commute when they go to the gym or for walks. And a lot of students are getting used to listening to podcasts for their courses. So a lot of times we as professors, we assign articles and books, but the way people learn now is through video and through documentaries as well as audio, such as podcasts. So I think a lot of professors are exploring this. I've even met certain professors who make their students create podcasts. So I had a professor here at Shenandoah University do a virtual exchange with a professor in the United Kingdom, and they did podcasts regarding climate change. So that's really interesting. I'm really excited to have that audience of professors, educators, people who are in the classroom who are teaching this material, and they want to be up to date on what's going on in the field, as well as finding content for their students. I also met a group, audience members who are young people, maybe in their 20s, 30s, but they're having children. So I met a young man who is listening to the podcast and he's going to have a daughter. So there is a group of people out there that are having children, specifically daughters, or they already have daughters and they're interested in how they can be a good parent. And Maryam is a source of inspiration to them. As I've discussed already, I have 3 daughters myself. And as my daughters got older, I became more interested in the topic of daughters and daughters in the Qur'an, in the Bible. And I started writing more about the topic. As I mentioned, post 9/11, I was really interested in Abraham, and I wrote a lot about that. And I still have those articles, which you can see regarding the patriarch. But Abraham is all about sons, right? He has Isaac, he has Ishmael. But Mary makes us think about daughters. Maryam is mentioned in the Quran first as a daughter. She's referred to as a daughter. Of course, later she'll have a son in Jesus, Isa. But she is a protagonist and a woman and a daughter first. So I think many of our listeners have gravitated to that and they're looking to that. How do you raise a daughter in contemporary times? How do you do it with the concept of religion or spirituality? What can scripture teach us about having daughters? So these are things that I think a lot of our listeners are thinking about. Many of you may be daughters yourself, right? You may have grown up in a family where you were the only daughter, or there were multiple daughters. Or maybe there was a daughter and a son, and you saw how the daughters were treated in one way or the sons in another. So I think Maryam raises a lot of those questions and puts them to the surface, where figures like Abraham, who are amazing, do not necessarily touch those topics. And as I complete season 1, I'm always reinterested and renewed my interest in Maryam. So Maryam is just really a fascinating figure, going back through the verses, seeing how she's mentioned, her personal voice, how she talks and how she asks questions and teaches those around her. Maryam is a figure in her own right and someone who is a model of emulation and a protagonist. And I'm currently writing the introduction to my book, Islamic Mary, and I'm reading a lot of books on Abraham. And really, in the beginning 2000s, there was so much effort put on Abraham. You had books that talked about the idea of the children of Abraham. You had books that talked about Ishmael instructing Isaac by my co-author John Kaltner, the idea that Ishmael representing the Muslims and the Muslim community, teaching Isaac, those people who come from Judaism and Christianity. You had people writing books on the footsteps of Abraham and how we can learn from his story and create global peace and harmony. So there was so much attention to Abraham, and then later on there was critiques of how people are using Abraham. So you had John Levinson's Inheriting Abraham, where he's critical about this idea of creating this one neutral Abraham and how we have to study the different religious traditions. You have books like Carol Bacos talking about the family of Abraham. Let's not forget about Sarah and Sarah or Hajar or Hagar, and that they're important elements too. And we have to also look at the differences between how these figures are presented, not only the similarities. So you have this move post 9/11 towards Abraham, then you have this critique. And now I'm seeing a lot more effort toward Maryam. And I think this is because people are realizing the importance of Christian-Muslim dialogue and relationship. Also, questions of women and spirituality and religion are coming to the forefront. And people are interested in scripture. They want to know the commentaries. They want to read the Qur'an directly as well as the Bible. And they see Maryam has a prominent role. So yes, Abraham is amazing. Yes, Abraham is worthy of study. But I think there has been a shift towards focusing on Maryam, and exploring how she operates within scripture and throughout Islamic history. And as we will continue, we will look at the chapter of Maryam or Mary. And just like there is a chapter of Abraham or Ibrahim in the Quran, Maryam has her own chapter as well. And this is something that, as we'll continue to explore, the Prophet Muhammad had a special relationship with Maryam. He mentions her as one of the best women of all time, alongside his first wife Khadija, then his daughter Fatima, and then the wife of Pharaoh, Asiya. So in the future, what are we going to do together? First, one of the things I would like to do is start the chapter of Maryam. Maryam is a remarkable chapter in the Quran surah. It has a unique rhyme scheme. It talks about issues of mercy, of vulnerability, of love. Many times when people do commentaries of the Quran, they look at the chapter of Yusuf or Joseph. And that chapter is also unique and amazing in its own right. But Maryam, in many ways, has been overlooked. And this chapter really tells us a lot about Islam. It tells us a lot about the early Muslim community, the Prophet Muhammad, the struggles that they faced, and how Maryam was a source of inspiration to that community, and how Maryam continues to inspire Muslim communities throughout the world, but especially in minority contexts. I'm also thinking about the idea of series. So just like we have a series on the chapters or the verses in Ali Imran, we want to do a series on the chapter of Maryam. I'm thinking of a series on Quranic vulnerability. So as I mentioned, Maryam is amazing in the Quran, is that she's very open about how she's feeling. And she mentions that when she feels the pain of childbirth, that she goes alone by herself and she screams out that I wish I had died. I wish I had been forgotten. And at that moment, God responds and gives her a stream and also some ripe dates. So this idea of vulnerability is throughout the Quran. And I feel that when reading the Quran in the chapter of Maryam, you can see how Maryam is connected to other Quranic figures that also express their plight. So you see, for instance, Zechariah, he talks about how he's old, his bones are frail, and how he needs God's protection, and he needs a son to carry out his legacy. You also see that with Jonah or Yunus, where he's in the belly of the whale, and he cries out that he affirms God, he believes God is unique, and that he was among the wrongdoers. So this theme of chronic vulnerability, of calling out, is something that I want to explore in a future series. Also, holidays are always an interesting topic to explore. So often in Muslim communities, I get invitations to speak about Maryam and Jesus, Isa during Christmas time. A series I'm thinking about of what is the relationship of Muslims to Christmas, for instance, or Easter? How about Christians to Ramadan? So what are the role of holidays within religious traditions? When I was younger, there was a movement within my community that said that Muslims should celebrate Christmas because we affirm Jesus as the prophet. But is that correct? Is that orthodox? And what type of Jesus is it, right? Is it Jesus the prophet, Jesus the Son of God? So these are things I want to explore, that we often think about these topics during the holiday season. And as I mentioned, I want to continue to do interviews of different people, and I want to unlock or promote some of the ideas that people are working on. So there's so many really interesting books and articles coming out in Quranic studies, also within studies of the Quran and Bible, as well as interreligious studies. So people are working and writing fascinating books, articles, documentaries, and often people don't necessarily get the time to read those works because of their busy schedules. So podcasts is a way to make those works accessible to people and to make them something that's easily digestible. So if I had to read, for instance, the dissertation of 400 pages, or I had the opportunity to listen to a podcast about that person talking about their spiritual life, their background, where they're coming from, how they got interested in the topic, and then the content of their work, personally, I would pick that podcast, right? But that podcast may generate new interest for me that I may return to the dissertation to learn more and look at the footnotes and some of the finer points that were expressed in the audio. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. Your support and listenership is really important to me. I want to encourage you to subscribe. If you haven't already, tell your friends, your students, your colleagues about this podcast. You can text them right now or share this episode with them. Also, I've enabled a new feature on the show notes, so you can actually text me feedback on the podcast itself. Tell me what you like. Do you want to see more teaching? Do you want to see more interviews, more recaps, reflections? What's resonating with you? And what would you find helpful for whether it's your personal religious or spiritual journey or your role as an educator? And of course, you can visit my website and join my newsletter. You can see my various research and articles, and you can learn more about my forthcoming book on the Islamic Mary. So thanks once again, and I look forward to being in touch. Take care.